Millions of fans watched the Minnesota Vikings reach 4 Super Bowls in 8 years during the 1970s. Built around a defensive line so feared it got its own nickname from a novelty song, the Purple People Eaters. No team in NFL history has ever been to the championship game that many times without winning once. That failure became as much a part of this team's identity as the violence it dished out on the field. A wrong turn that followed one man for 60 years. A cocaine habit that ended in bankruptcy. A quarterback fraud case straight out of the business pages. This is where the Vikings' Purple People Eaters really ended up. One is the defensive end who played more consecutive games than almost anyone in NFL history, and who is remembered first, unfairly, for the 6 seconds it took him to run in exactly the wrong direction. Jim Marshall started 270 consecutive regular season games across 19 seasons in Minnesota, a streak that stood as the record for any defensive player until Brett Favre broke it decades later, and helped anchor all four of the Vikings' Super Bowl teams as a three-time All-Pro. Born in Danville, Kentucky in 1937 and raised in Columbus, Ohio, Marshall starred at Ohio State before the Cleveland Browns drafted him and immediately traded him to Minnesota's brand-new expansion franchise in 1961. On October 25, 1964, Marshall scooped up a 49ers fumble at Kezar Stadium and sprinted 66 yards the wrong way, crossing his own goal line and flinging the ball away in celebration before realizing he had just given San Francisco a safety, a mistake he later said meant imagining 100 million people watching the worst moment of his life on a loop, forever. Off the field, Marshall lived just as dangerously as he played, a frequent skydiver who crashed his own glider plane shortly after retiring, and the survivor of a 1971 snowmobile expedition in the Rocky Mountains, where a sudden blizzard trapped his party overnight and one of his companions froze to death beside him. In 1991, at age 53, Marshall was arrested in Duluth and charged with possessing more than 57 grams of cocaine. NFL Films later ranked him the second-best player never inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Jim Marshall died on June 3, 2025, at age 87, following what the team described only as a lengthy hospitalization. Marshall set the tone for an entire era of Vikings football just by refusing to come off the field. Jim Marshall spent 6 decades being remembered for 66 yards run in the wrong direction, a mistake that never once stopped him from showing up for the next 269 games in a row. Tell me in the comments if that streak surprises you as much as the run itself does, because the next man on this list turned his own worst years into a mission to help other players survive theirs. 2 is the defensive end whose cocaine habit cost him roughly $2,000 a week at the height of his career, and who turned his own recovery into a second, quieter legacy that outlasted anything he did on the field. Carl Eller anchored Minnesota's line for 15 seasons, won 6 Pro Bowl selections, and was elected to the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 2004. A devastating pass rusher nicknamed Moose, who played in all 4 of the franchise's losing Super Bowls. Born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina in 1942, Eller grew up under Jim Crow segregation, so total that he later described freezing on the front steps of a childhood home decades later, unable to walk through a front door that had been forbidden to him as a boy. His addiction to alcohol and cocaine deepened across 2 decades, by his own account shortening his career, straining his marriage, and precipitating a personal bankruptcy in 1980. He got sober in early 1981 and became a licensed drug and alcohol counselor, founding Triumph Life Centers, a network of substance abuse clinics across the Twin Cities that treated thousands of patients through the 1980s and 1990s, and later serving as president of the NFL Retired Players Association, advocating for the same kind of health and financial benefits he wished had existed for himself. In November of 2025, false reports spread across social media claiming Eller had died. He responded by posting Thanksgiving photos to prove he was very much alive. Moose Eller spent his playing career chasing down opposing quarterbacks with terrifying speed. Carl Eller has spent the 4 decades since chasing down the same addiction that, once cost him a fortune, this time trying to make sure other retired players never had to fight it alone. 3 is the defensive tackle so far from a can't-miss prospect that Los Angeles gave up on him after a single season, only for him to spend the next decade as the quiet, immovable center of the league's most feared front four. Gary Larson was a 10th-round pick out of tiny Concordia College in Minnesota, traded away by the Rams after backing up Hall of Famer Merlin Olsen as a rookie, before Minnesota brought him home and installed him at defensive tackle for 11 seasons. Born in Fargo, North Dakota in 1940, Larson made 2 Pro Bowls, played in 3 Super Bowls, and along with Marshall Eller and Page, started every single game together from 1968 through 1973, a run of togetherness almost unheard of on a modern defensive line. Unlike his 3 more decorated teammates, Larson never earned the individual acclaim that came with a bust in Canton, spending his career instead absorbing double teams so the more famous names beside him could get to the quarterback. He retired quietly after the 1974 season and settled far from the spotlight in Lacey, Washington, where he and his wife raised 4 children and welcomed 9 grandchildren. In a rare interview decades into retirement, Larson admitted openly that he sometimes forgets things now, but waved off any drama about it, saying simply that it was part of the game he chose to play, and he had made his peace with the trade a long time ago. He is alive today, in his mid-80s, having spent more than 50 years exactly where he always seemed most comfortable, out of the headlines entirely. Larson occupied blockers for a decade so 3 more famous teammates could collect the sacks. Gary Larson is still here today, in a small town in Washington State, having decided a long time ago that being forgotten by history was a fair trade for everything football gave him. If Larson's quiet ending is the one that surprised you, hit subscribe, because the next member of this same defensive line took the exact opposite path once the camera stopped rolling. 4 is the defensive tackle who spent his football off-seasons in law school and who became one of the most improbable second-act success stories in the history of the sport. Alan Page won the 1971 NFL Most Valuable Player Award, the first defensive player in league history to receive the honor, anchoring Minnesota's line for 11 seasons and finishing with an estimated 148.5 sacks, still among the highest totals ever recorded for a defensive tackle. Born in Canton, Ohio in 1945, in the same city that would later house his Hall of Fame bust, Page starred on Notre Dame's 1966 national championship team before Minnesota made him a first-round pick in 1967. While still an active player in the 1970s, Page quietly enrolled at the University of Minnesota Law School, earning his Juris Doctor in 1978, the same year he was still recording sacks on Sundays. After retiring in 1981, he practiced law, served 7 years as an assistant Minnesota Attorney General, and in 1992 was elected to the Minnesota Supreme Court, becoming the first African-American ever to serve on that court, a seat he held for 22 years until mandatory retirement age forced him off the bench in 2015. In 1988, the same year he entered the Pro Football Hall of Fame, Page and his late wife Diane founded the Page Education Foundation, which has since awarded more than $16 million in scholarships to over 8,000 Minnesota students of color. He is alive today, in his early 80s, still cheering on runners at the Twin Cities Marathon most years, still playing his sousaphone from the sidelines to encourage strangers he's never met. Page terrorized opposing quarterbacks for over a decade, using nothing but speed and leverage. Alan Page then spent the next 4 decades proving that the most feared lineman in franchise history could also become the most quietly consequential public servant in the entire state of Minnesota. 5 is the scrambling quarterback who reinvented the position with his mobility and improvisation, and whose second career as a business entrepreneur eventually landed him in exactly the kind of trouble his football career never once did. Fran Tarkenton led Minnesota to 3 of the franchise's 4 Super Bowl appearances, won the 1975 NFL MVP award, and retired holding nearly every meaningful career passing record in league history, a 9-time Pro Bowler nicknamed the Scrambler for an elusiveness that made him nearly impossible for defensive linemen to sack cleanly. Born in Richmond, Virginia in 1940 and raised in Athens, Georgia, the son of a Methodist minister, Tarkenton was traded to the New York Giants in 1967 before Minnesota brought him back in 1972 for the most productive stretch of his career. He began building businesses even while he was still an active player, and by the 1980s had become one of the most visible former athletes in American commerce, appearing regularly on television as a motivational and business figure. That success collided with serious trouble in the mid-1990s, when Tarkenton faced government charges of financial fraud tied to one of his companies, a controversy that shadowed the same entrepreneurial reputation he had spent 2 decades building. He weathered it and kept working, founding new ventures well into his 80s, telling an interviewer at 77 that he still went to the office every day simply because good health was a blessing he felt obligated to put to use helping other people. He is alive today, in his mid-80s, still running technology and consulting businesses out of Atlanta, watching modern quarterbacks play the position he helped invent. Tarkenton scrambled his way around some of the most feared pass rushers of his era for 18 seasons. Fran Tarkenton built a second empire in business, only to learn that outrunning trouble off the field was a very different game than outrunning it on one. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe, because the man who coached every one of these players through 4 losing Super Bowls never once let any of them see him rattled about it. 6 is the head coach so stoic that his own Hall of Fame induction speech included the line that you die a little every time you lose, and you simply have to get over it. Bud Grant coached the Vikings for 18 seasons, leading Minnesota to the playoffs in most of them and to 4 Super Bowl appearances between 1969 and 1976, losing all 4, a record that still stands as the most championship game defeats by any coach in NFL history. Born Harry Peter Grant Jr. in Superior, Wisconsin in 1927, Grant was a 3-sport athlete who played both professional football and professional basketball, winning an NBA championship with the Minneapolis Lakers before turning fully to coaching. First with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the Canadian Football League, where he won 4 Grey Cups, and then with Minnesota starting in 1967. His trademark purple cap and stone-faced sideline demeanor became as recognizable as the Purple People Eaters defense itself, and in 1994, he became the first person ever inducted into both the Pro Football Hall of Fame and the Canadian Football Hall of Fame. Grant coached 6 future Hall of Famers in Minnesota, including Fran Tarkenton, Alan Page, and Carl Eller, and colleagues who worked under him often said his outward coldness concealed a coach who cared for his players far more deeply than his public reputation ever suggested. He retired for good in 1985 and remained a constant, beloved presence around the Vikings organization for nearly 4 more decades, still making appearances at the team's facility well into his 90s. Bud Grant died on March 11, 2023, at his home in Minnesota at age 95. Grant built one of the most dominant defenses in football history without ever once raising his voice about it. Bud Grant went to his grave the same way he coached for 18 seasons, calm, composed, and entirely unwilling to let 4 championship losses define the man underneath the purple cap. They rest now in the memory of a fumble returned exactly the wrong way, in a Twin Cities recovery clinic built by a man who once spent $2,000 a week trying to destroy himself, and in a quiet Minnesota home that finally emptied out at 95. 3 are still alive today, one keeping company with his own forgetfulness in a small town in Washington, one still playing the sousaphone from the sidelines of a marathon he never ran, and one still building companies in Atlanta at an age when most men have long since stopped trying. The Purple People Eaters never got the ring the rest of this era's defenses collected. And decades later, the record they actually left behind turned out to have very little to do with what happened on any of those 4 Sundays in January.